Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. Tomorrow's the beginning of the end of the world, or, depending on your point of view, maybe it's the eve of America becoming great again. Today is January 19th, and you're listening to episode 16. Politicoast is a podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across this country. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you found this podcast, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter where we're at PoliticoastPod.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. Well, let's launch into our first segment, the O'Leary factor. The Conservative Party of Canada's French debate is over and done with, which means the people who really can't speak French, i.e. Kevin O'Leary, are now free to enter the debate. He talked about wanting to enter after a lot of people had dropped out and the field had narrowed down, but we really only had one or two names.
Dan Lindsay and Tony Clement, neither of whom were big stars on the campaign.
And so O'Leary is now in, and he's getting the natural whirlwind of media attention, both positive and negative. And I think he's got that same star power approach that Trump obviously took, and that's the obvious comparison everyone's making, where all press is good press. And I know we don't really want to talk about him, but it's almost impossible not to at this point.
Yeah, this has kind of been the cloud hanging over the Conservative leadership race, and that everybody was wondering, will he, won't he? He'd kind of been floating the idea for a while, but also sort of endorsed Bernier, so it was kind of up in the air on whether or not he'd go for it. And I think he was also waiting to see if there was any of the big names who were going to come in. You know, he probably didn't want to be running against Peter MacKay, but when all he has to worry about is Kelly Leitch and Maxime Bernier, he's probably feeling a little more confident, although I wouldn't necessarily be if I was him.
Yeah, it's a very different kind of race in Canada to win a leadership here. It's not open primaries. It's not just star power. He needs to either get people to sign up for memberships, and coming in this late puts him at a huge handicap. He has much less time to sign people up, or he has to flip existing Conservative Party members over, many of whom will already be attached to Chong or Bernier or Leitch or one of the other candidates. And so his path to victory is harder. And if you add on top of that the preferential ballot, which means he either needs to get a lot of second choices or just 50% of the people on the first ballot. And even Trump didn't achieve that in most of his runoffs.
Yeah, Donald Trump actually got one of the lowest percentage of votes of any successful candidate for their party's nomination. And he did that by winning a bunch of the big winner-take-all states with pluralities but not majorities of the vote. And that's just not how the Conservative leadership race works. Here, you have to win an actual majority of votes in a runoff system, and every riding has the same number of votes to allocate, which also means you kind of have to win everywhere or pull in a lot of support from quite a broad range of people. You can't just win all of the Albertan Conservatives and cruise your way to victory that way. And that is where his other big disadvantage comes in, is Quebec. Doesn't speak French, being incredibly dismissive of the idea of having to learn French, though he's backpedaled on that somewhat, promising to learn French by 2019. But right now he's starting with 25% of the vote not accessible at all, which means he has to win even more among the rest of the country, and that's going to be an uphill battle when he only can now start fundraising, can't blow his own fortune the way Trump has done to finance his campaign. So, going to have trouble signing up members and enough of them, and he's going to have trouble fundraising with this little time left.
Well, he is facing the same sort of large divided field that Donald Trump entered. And that's the kind of place where I think these media stars do really well, is because there's a whole bunch of people bickering over policies about the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation and supply management. And he's just like, jobs, jobs, jobs. I talk about jobs, and it doesn't mean anything. But to a lot of people, it doesn't matter.
At least speaking to the small sample of local Conservatives I've spoken with, there definitely seems to be a sense of wanting to seize the moment and win. And I think there's going to be a fair bit of the membership's going to be looking at, are you going to be viable going forward into 2019? And with a unilingual candidate with such a long history of questionable statements that probably the Liberal opposition research team practically salivating at him. In the next election, you could do an ad a day with everything he said, and just a new soundbite to bring up, and just, one thing after another, day after day, and it wouldn't even be that hard. You just have to go on YouTube and pull them.
Well, a bunch of journalists are already doing that. CBC and the National Observer have pieces out sort of exposing Kevin O'Leary's poor business practices. I know National Observer has a piece up talking about how Kevin O'Leary's deal almost ran Mattel into the ground, just how it was a bad business deal. And we'll put a link to that story in the show notes. And he throws out a lot of really weird and ridiculous suggestions like selling Senate seats. But I think he's got some advantage. Stephen Harper managed to win his majority without Quebec. He showed there is a path to prime ministership, sort of disregarding an entire province. He obviously didn't try to disregard them, and he did learn French, and he could speak it decently, better than I can. I think the other thing working for Kevin O'Leary versus Donald Trump is he's not the same kind of extreme. Kevin O'Leary says a lot of ridiculous and absurd things, but he's not Kelly Leach on the immigrants question. He's fine with immigration because he knows Canada needs immigrants.
And that's the thing that I think is going to help him every time somebody compares him to Donald Trump, is when he isn't Donald Trump, he suddenly looks much better in comparison. We've talked about the expectation game and talking about how he's our Donald Trump. It's just setting the expectation so low that he barely has to lift his foot off the ground to step over the bar.
And then on the other hand, even though he's not taking those sort of extreme positions that Kelly Leach is, I think he's really just like cut the legs out of her entire platform. If she's coming forward and being like, I'm the, populist of Canada for the Conservatives, he can go, no, I'm actually talking about people and I'm not coming from the establishment. And then he can point to all of the letters after her name. She doesn't know exactly how many there are, but there's a lot. And he can just talk about business and TV. And you know him because you've seen him on the CBC.
Yeah, but at the same time, part of the problem coming in this late is kind of the major territories have all been staked out. You got Kelly Leach running on the populist side, and it's going to be hard for him to kind of unseat that a bit, especially if he doesn't kind of go further, which, based on everything else he said, he isn't likely to. And with some of his statements on, the CBC, reproductive, all of these stuff, they sound more at home in the Liberal Party, to be honest. So it's going to be hard to outflank Kelly Leach on that file. Bernier's already locked down the Libertarian side, and O'Leary isn't much of a free marketer anyway. He's much more kind of your pro-business, crony capitalist than a free marketer. So you can't really move into that space either, which, leaves the media shock value and the name recognition, but not a huge amount else to go off of.
Well, I definitely won't write him off because the traditional wisdom of politics doesn't seem to apply to superstars. It's why Trudeau did so well despite having very little to put forward. He just oozed charisma to the point that people didn't really care that he wasn't as experienced or that his platform wasn't necessarily as fleshed out. Or on a lot of issues, he sort of wavered and said, well, I'll remove the bad parts of Bill C-51, but leave the core of it so that he could try to appease everyone. And people went, oh, that's fine. He's different and he's got the better message. And so that's the kind of path I see Kevin O'Leary going, where the content doesn't matter. And it's in the realm of the post-truth politics and those kind of things, which is frustrating and very difficult to break down. I don't know if there's the appetite there for it or not, but I wouldn't write him off.
True, but at the same time, it's a lot harder when you have such a wide field to compete against. You're probably going to get a lot of people who are, strong supporters who'll come out. But the question is, can he win over those second and third choice votes, which are going to be necessary with such a large slate. It's practically guaranteed nobody's going to win on the first round, and that's pulling in those second and third choices. And I think it's the same problem Kelly Leach has, where if you stake out such a strong position this way, you're probably not going to get many of those second or third choice votes coming in. And the person I'd actually really watch out for sneaking up the middle is Andrew Scheer. He's got a lot of support from the caucus, and everybody seems to like him. Doesn't have a huge depth of policy, but reasonably personable. Everybody seems to like him. Nobody really dislikes him at all. So I could easily see him being number 3 on everybody's ballot and winning that way.
He's going to be the Ed Stelmach of federal politics now. Just that sort of compromise. Everyone's like, well, it could be worse. And Ed Stelmach did do well in Alberta while he wasn't being stabbed in the back. So maybe that'll work out for Scheer.
We touched on it briefly, but if he does somehow manage to win this leadership race, what do you think his chances are going into 2019, especially with a lot of those questionable things like selling Senate seats? It's going to be really easy to kind of paint him as this, destroyer of democracy in our system.
I think it all comes down to what the state of the economy is at that point. I know there's a lot of people in Alberta who are hurting, and those are the people who are looking for someone to just sort of flip the table, upset the system. And O'Leary is clearly positioning himself there. Even his most ridiculous ideas, like the Senate seats one, I think people would rather just let him try that as a way to reform the Senate, as it were. And maybe it would invalidate it, and then they could burn it to the ground or change it up that way. But I get the sense it's all going to come down to, are people angry at Justin Trudeau and want a sort of center-right populist to replace a center-left populist?
I don't know if I really buy that. Because, Alberta, at most, the Liberals are going to lose 4 seats. That's not going to be enough to push them out of their majority, let alone into second place. And you really got to look at the where the winnable seats are. That tends to be the suburbs of the big cities, and that's probably going to be what's going to decide the next election. And are the city suburbs really crying out for a right-wing populist? And I just don't get that sense.
It will all come down to Greater Toronto and that sort of southern Ontario, especially if O'Leary is essentially writing off Quebec, except for maybe some bits of Montreal, if he can really appeal to the Anglophones there. There's also a chance that he stokes up separatist angst, especially if he, say, won the prime ministership in 2019 and only had marginally better French at that point. How grumpy will the separatists be? And will they see him as antithetical to their sort of vision for Canada?
Okay, moving on to segment 2, Someone Noticed Us. So last week, the New York Times published a piece by Dan Levine about our province's campaign finance laws and political funding.
It's always great when the big real newspapers of America pay attention to little old us up here in Canada. It's a little embarrassing when it's a story about how we're essentially as corrupt as more questionable parts of the world. I think Levin compared us to China and Russia at some of the worst parts that he's seen, where there was nothing new in his story. For anyone who's been following BC politics, he recapped very nicely everything we already know, that Christy Clark takes her salary, but also gets a big top-up from the party, say $277,000 since 2011, while no other political party leaders in the province get money from their parties. He pointed out that the Conflict of Interest Commissioner's son, John Paul Fraser, is a deputy minister in cabinet, and that both the commissioner, through his law firm, and the son have both donated to the BC Liberal Party. I mean, you'd expect a deputy minister to be a supporter of the party he's a member of, but it's a little funny seeing the person who investigates alleged conflicts of interest and never finds any, ever, being donors. He points out there's no cap on corporate or union donations, and in fact, literally anyone can donate to BC politics, whether you're, a Alberta oil tycoon or a American mining company. And he named specifically Imperial Metals as one of the BC Liberal donors whose, quote, tailing pond spilled billions of gallons of toxic debris in 2014, but was then permitted to operate an even larger mine in the province. Not saying it's political payback, but sort of implying that you can get away with some things if you line the pockets of the premier. He also points out Kinder Morgan and the other oil industry execs who support the Trans Mountain Pipeline donated over $718,000 to the BC Liberals up until March 2016, and probably more since. And in another interview, he just talked about BC as a Kafkaesque dystopian nightmare of shady politics and conflicts of interest. And it's phrases like that I think lets you get into the New York Times. Once a story like this drops and it talks about our little province, global news, Metro, everyone's got to cover it and go, what? People are paying attention to us. What's so ridiculous, though, is the government's response has been pretty pathetic. Suzanne Anton was the only one to actually reply to the Times piece, or be quoted in the Times piece from the government, and she didn't really answer any specific questions, just said, we follow the rules kind of thing, not pointing out there aren't any, or there are very few to follow. And she also pointed out they've never been found in violation, which is true. Later on, Deputy Premier Rich Coleman called the claims in this New York Times piece laughable. And it almost reminds me of the Trump press conference when he, yells at CNN as fake news. The New York Times is a reputable newspaper doing reputable work, and everyone's sort of taking the story seriously, except the government, who I think are in damage control and fallout.
Yeah, as you said, none of this is new. It's the top-up's been known about for quite a while. The rather loose campaign finance rules have been known for a while, but having such a big newspaper come out and say it's definitely thrown fuel onto the fire that was slowly smoldering in the background. But yeah, but what really stands out to me on this whole thing, and I can't believe it isn't against the law here, is that you can have a conflict of interest commissioner with a family relation in the government, and who also works for a firm that has donated to the government in the past, or both the governing party. And that just seems to me so obviously outside of the spirit of the Conflict of Interest Act that it's kind of amazing it wasn't put in there and even if it's permitted.
Yeah, even if it's all above board and permitted, it's the same kind of thing with what we were talking about with Justin Trudeau's Aga Khan Island visits. Someone just needs to look at this and go, this isn't quite right. These are intuitively not good situations to put yourself in.
Yeah, a lot of these sorts of conflict of interest acts or codes of conduct that you see both in the law and kind of corporate policies within the company and everything, almost all of them have a appearance of clause in there where that alone should be, it's not enough just to be technically within the spirit. You also have to, look like you're above board, and this definitely doesn't even look like it. And if it isn't illegal, it should be.
As we said, this has been covered a lot from the Globe and Mail, the Vancouver Sun, the Province. These aren't new allegations, but I think it's the kind of story that just sort of trickles and people go, oh yeah, that's just politics. Oh yeah, that's just politics. And I think it takes this level of almost finger wagging at us to really make it an issue. And I wonder if this is the kind of thing that starts to really make people go, all right, BC needs to clean up its act. We have international press laughing at us and calling us a banana republic because of our loose, non-existent campaign finance laws.
And Ontario basically just did that. They had a similarly lax system up until a few months ago when their own kind of cash for access fundraising scandal prompted the Liberal Party there, who's likewise been in power since the early 2000s, to finally put some restrictions in place. That's a little more unpopular than here, so I think went into a more stringent damage control mode than we have here. And with them, they're not in such bad shape in terms of popular opinion at the moment. I think they're drastically worried about their re-election and panicking, so they're probably not quite as inclined to start passing new legislation on the matter.
I was actually thinking the exact opposite, that a good strategy right now, with a bit more session before the election, is the perfect opportunity to say, you know what, we've been doing everything above board, but we're worried about what could happen after the election, and then sort of spin it and suggest that the NDP would, if they became government, not do or be just as bad.
Play off the union donation, something that's a common attack.
It's not that they even necessarily would have to cut out corporate and union donations, but you could do the obvious thing of banning foreign donations, and you could start to put in some restrictions, and you could say replace a conflict of interest commissioner with someone who doesn't have a conflict of interest. Like, there's a lot of little steps that would show action on the file without dismissing one of the world's best newspapers as a laughable rag. And I think that kind of basic attention to this file might stop the bleed preemptively, because this is the kind of story that becomes an election issue.
Yeah, it would definitely help. It just seems that the Christy Clark government tends to only do stuff when they really start to worry about how badly it's going to affect them, and I'm not sure they're quite at the stage yet on this.
Sure. We've definitely seen them act quickly. They recalled the legislature in the middle of the summer to pass this foreign buyers tax when they decided that instant the housing crisis had reached the exact tipping point where they needed to act, and not 3 months earlier or 3 months later. So they can act quickly when they decide it's in their best interest.
And I think you do bring up pretty much exactly how to spin it. And that's pretty much exactly what Kathleen Wynne did when she brought in the changes. Now, the party top-up thing, it's one of those things I, in theory, wouldn't have too much of a problem with. But, except for all the other shady stuff going on here. Premiers, prime ministers, they're also party leaders. And they do a fair bit of partisan work for the party. And it's not unreasonable that the compensation for that work comes from the organization they're doing the work for. Now, it would be a lot better if, we had something similar to the federal system where you can only spend $1,000, $1,500, or Quebec's system of $100 cap. If the cap was a lot lower, you wouldn't have such a big concern here because those sums are so small. It's hard. There's not really a quid pro quo, especially when it's being filtering through the organization. It just goes, it's a small little chunk going into general revenue for the party, then a small little chunk of that gets sent to the leader for, compensation for their work. And that wouldn't be the worst. I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that if the donations were so small and it was clearly, this is for the work you're doing for the party. But that's not the situation we have here.
Yeah, when you put all of these pieces together, especially like the New York Times did, you get such a messy picture that just obviously looks corrupt. And even if every, thing they've done isn't, and, they're clear of all of the conflicts of interest, the picture's still messy. On the other side of the aisle, we have the sort of good news story from the BC Green Party this week, where they announced that in 2016, they raised over $760,000, which is up almost double their 2015 fundraising. And most of that came in the last few months after they said we're not taking any more corporate or union donations. They never really had. But in perspective, that's essentially how much the BC Liberals got just from oil companies for one pipeline. So the Green Party has this really nice position where they can take the moral high ground. And they've taken it, and they showed they're not making as much money as the BC Liberals, but they're not hampered. And I think most people in BC would agree that $750,000 to spend on an election is probably more than enough. Obviously, our political parties are going to spend more, but, if we could bring the financing down to that much, people would probably be pretty happy.
Yeah, it's an arms race thing where everybody has to raise a whole bunch of money, because if they don't, everybody else is going to raise a whole bunch of money and outspend them. And there's no reason why you can't run an election on half or a third of the budget that typically goes to one. As the Liberal Party glibly pointed out to the American Reporter, the U.S. spent $1 billion on their election. You could probably do it for a significantly smaller chunk of change than that. And there's no reason you have to have that much money. I think this also is interesting in that it hints that there's a possible dissatisfaction with the two main parties. In addition to, people being more happy to support the Greens because they don't see them as being tied to unions or corporations, this also hints at the fact that people are looking for something other than the NDP as the place to park their not liberal vote, and their not liberal political donations.
Of course, there's always the partisan cynics who would say the BC Liberals are just nicely positioning themselves and the opposition so that the Green Party is in this better place to just sap votes from the NDP, and the Liberals can just sort of divide and conquer the province.
I'm just not sure that's going to be the best strategy going forward. You have a not particularly well-liked Liberal Party, but there just doesn't seem to be a particularly viable opposition to it, and if the Green Party can assert itself to be that other choice, you're probably going to be able to pull off votes from both the NDP and the Liberals, especially since Andrew Weaver's been trying to position the party between the two of them and ride that dissatisfaction up through the center, pull off your somewhat dissatisfied left flank to the Liberals and the right flank to the NDP, and he's not likely to become premier out of it, but he can go from one seat to a lot more if he can successfully channel that dissatisfaction with both of the parties.
Well, and the risk for the BC Liberals is a minority government, particularly coming off so many years in government. It'll be everyone's sort of inclination to push them out. We could end up with the sort of Bob Rae NDP minority coalition, only it would be an NDP Green Party coalition. Well, that might appease a lot of people. It would be a nightmare scenario for the Liberals. And our third segment tonight is it's been Trudeau story time across the country. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's been going on a sort of campaign 2.0 to listen to the people and have little town hall meetings where he takes off-the-cuff questions and does a lot of selfies, some of which follow up in more even tougher questions and more embarrassing moments. It's one of those things where every stop generates stories for him. Both good ones, that, he answered some questions, told us some things about refugees or whatever, and some more gaffes, like he tries to relate to refugees, where he brags about his grandfather coming from Scotland to Canada, leaving out the fact his grandfather came to an estate in West Van and was a cabinet minister when he moved here.
I don't think becoming a cabinet minister is kind of your typical immigrant experience. And, while this probably helped get some positive headlines in kind of the local newspapers, such as they exist anymore, Trudeau visits town or whatever, in terms of what's shown up in the national press, it's mostly been the gaffes that have made it forward, and this was kind of hastily organized after Christmas, and fallout from a couple of files were starting to dodge the Liberals, and I'm not sure they're being particularly successful at changing the message with this. When you have gaffes like that, you have issues over what language you speak when you answer questions, and this is something that just seems completely bizarre to me. So when he was in Sherbrooke, Quebec, in the Eastern Townships, a region of Quebec with a decent Anglophone population there, he took a question in English from a woman in the audience and then proceeded to answer in French. Bunch of Anglophones got pretty annoyed, felt disrespected about this. One of them's even gone so far as to lodge a complaint with the Official Languages Commissioner over it, which is its own kind of interesting thing that we've gone from will the honeymoon last forever to being investigated by two different government commissioners in the span of about 3 months.
And that is a follow-up to last week's episode, where we were talking about his vacation to the Caribbean with the Aga Khan, and now the ethics commissioner is looking into that whole situation.
Yes. So yeah, he definitely seems to have kind of lost that common everyman touch that he was able to project, but never really fit Trudeau himself when you actually look at his background and everything. but does seem to have lost a little bit of that sense of really connecting with Canadians, which this is trying to get back. But when you just made such an obvious political mistake as not answering in the language the person asks in, it's just a little shocking he blew it that badly on this.
I almost wonder, though, because Trudeau's talent is this kind of campaigning style. During the election, a lot of the media sort of dismissed his rallies and his events as, in the same way they dismissed Donald Trump's rallies and events as, these won't connect. And he said, oh, look, he said this stupid thing here. It's almost a sort of Ottawa media bubble that we can easily fall into. And not having been to one of his events, I wonder, is the sense the same there? Obviously, there are people going there who are very upset and who are sort of complaining, and people who have their real legitimate gripes about him and his sort of failures over the last year. But it could also be really good for him. Even if every headline is negative, it's still a lot of headlines that talk about Trudeau, and it's a lot of sort of social media and him talking to people. The challenge is right now he's not pitting himself against anyone else. The NDP's in a leadership race, the Conservatives in a leadership race. He's not even in Parliament at the moment to sort of be pushing issues through. So he's running against himself, and so he's running against those negative stories.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is there's no such thing as bad publicity. Is fine if you're starved for publicity, but he's the Prime Minister. Everything he does gets a story done about it. And in that case, bad publicity is bad publicity. He doesn't need to get his name out there. Everybody knows Trudeau's Prime Minister, and when you get that negative publicity, it kind of undermines the message, and it doesn't bring him more notoriety, which is the main benefit of the any publicity is good publicity aspect. And, well, you can definitely, connect with people and one-on-one and stuff. Canada's just too big to really do it. You can only make so many stops on a tour before you have to go back to Parliament, and he's not going to shake the hand of every Canadian, or even every 10 Canadians. And when all the media stories out of it are mostly negative, at least at the national level, it's going to be a little harder to translate that into a positive message going forward and try and bump up the approval numbers.
I guess it'll come down to how much people connect to the negative stories. Some of the flaps might not resonate with a lot of people. They might just go, well, at least he's getting out there. And it's that kind of thing they might take away. And that's where I think it might not fail for him, even if every story is terrible. But we'll have to sort of see.
Yeah, I don't see this hurting him very much in the short term. But I see the sorts of, my cabinet minister grandfather's an immigrant, so I know what immigration's like. These, not connecting with people and, speaking to them in their language. He's not going to drop down to 15% approval rating over any of these things. They're minor. It's that story and the narrative they slowly build. And there's definitely the sense, immediately after the whole cash for access thing that plagued him all fall, and then the Aga Khan story, that he's losing touch with the average Canadian, and these things feed into that. And it's going to be that slow burn that eats away at that approval, and the sense that, Justin Trudeau's looking out for them and kind of knows what they're going through. That when you have a fresh-faced Conservative and NDP parties waiting in the wings in 2019, it's going to be a lot harder to repeat the success of the last election.
All right, well, let's close out the show with a couple quick stories. Some of these are going to be a little bit bigger, but we'll try and keep it brief. First up, 3 First Nations groups in BC have announced the legal action they're taking against the federal government and the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline. Most notably, the Coldwater Indian Reserve has challenged the pipeline on the basis that when the original pipeline was built through their lands, they didn't have the legal rights to challenge it at the time. They couldn't hire lawyers, and they couldn't really appeal or even take part in the discussions. So they've sort of said, we weren't asked in the first place. Even if we were talked to about the sort of doubling it, that's not valid because we didn't even look at the first 10. I think this story is just sort of important to show that these challenges are going to keep coming up. And there are tough questions about these. I don't know what the answer to their question is, but it's the kind of thing that's going to push this pipeline further and further into the future.
Yeah, this was something we brought up when the approvals were first announced, that there was going to be court challenges, and, well, this is the first batch to come out against it. Whether or not they're going to succeed is still, I think, a little up in the air. They have a reasonable point to make, and I can see the courts going for that.
Of course, the courts could always agree with them, but not actually grant them anything.
Yes, the consultation isn't a veto, and so it might not block it, but it's probably definitely going to push construction down several years in the future, or, Kinder Morgan might work out some sort of deal ahead of time, or apply for a permit to route that section of the pipeline around there. There's a bunch of different ways they can go about that. So it doesn't mean, even if the challenge succeeds, it doesn't mean the pipeline's dead, but it's definitely going to push things back further. So a little closer to home here, Main Street Research has released a poll of Canadian mayors, and Gregor Robertson, the mayor of Vancouver, came in dead last among the major cities' mayors in terms of popularity, with a 50% approval, 45% disapproval.
It's a very polarized sort of feeling they found in Vancouver. They actually highlighted in their reporting that Vancouver was unique in that people either very strongly approved of Gregor or they very strongly disapproved. There wasn't much in the middle ground. And having only 5% of your respondents say they don't really know if they have an opinion or they're not sure is actually pretty impressive, especially for a mayor where most people don't really have a good feel for their mayor. They're like, all right, he's fine or she's fine.
Yeah, generally, the trash gets collected, the streets don't have too many potholes in them, people are more or less satisfied. Local politics is a lot more about can you actually just deliver the core services effectively, and not so much about the overarching ideological issues that plague higher levels of politics.
I think this kind of just shows how much sort of ideology there is in Vancouver politics. It's ideological fights over bike lanes, over greenest city challenges, over all these things he's sort of brought through. And the style he's taken has gotten more partisan over the years, and it pisses a lot of people off. Like, he has famous scenes in council meetings of sort of swearing about other people from the NPA, the non-partisan alliance, which is obviously partisan. What I also found interesting about this poll was the most popular mayor is Ottawa's Jim Watson, who I initially thought he had a 63% approval, but no, his net approval rating is 63%. So that means his approval minus the people who disapprove of him. He's leading Ottawa into Canada's 150th celebrations and has a whole bunch of things, so I can only see his rating going up. Calgary's mayor, Naheed Nenshi, was wildly popular for a long time, but his net approval is at 34%, which is pretty healthy still. And Edmonton's mayor, Don Iveson, who I also followed, his approval's at 25% these days. Interestingly, John Tory in Toronto is down to, a net approval plus 19. All of these are still much better than Vancouver's plus 5. But it's sort of interesting to see where the mayors are sitting at.
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes to show some of the strains the city's feeling. And the high cost of housing has, I think, taken its toll here as well. And the city doesn't get as much focus as it should, but because they are the ones who have the most powerful policy lever around this, aren't really using it, but most of the ire seems to have gotten directed up to the provincial politicians, because Christy Clark is less popular, and because there's a sense, for better or worse, that it's a provincial issue.
The only other thing I wish they'd really looked at the rest of Metro Vancouver, because a lot of the cities they polled out of these top 10 are actually smaller than like Surrey or Burnaby. I know Burnaby's generally been ranked as one of the best run cities in Canada under Derek Corrigan's leadership, and it'd be interesting to see how popular he is. Or the same goes for Surrey, where Linda Hepner, I believe, is still mayor. We'll have to wait until our next municipal elections in 2018 to sort of get some of the better polling on that question. But we're definitely going to keep an eye on that. Next up, there's a bit of a scandal at the top of Canada's military this last week. Maybe you can run us through that.
To call it a scandal would imply we know what's actually going on up there and that something scandalous has occurred. This Tuesday, the Chief of Defence Staff relieved the Vice Chief of Defence Staff of all his duties and commands and placed him on kind of an indefinite suspension. And that's basically all we know about it. The letter that was sent out to the senior members of the forces on this was very brief, just basically reiterating that, he's not in command. All of his duties are hereby ceased and will be transferred to the Chief of Maritime Staff, who's going to assume the Vice Chief's position as well, temporarily, while this gets sorted out. But the hint is that it's probably going to turn into a permanent dismissal, but very little's known about this right now. We've got some anonymous sources saying it is related to the leaking of classified information regarding the national shipbuilding strategy, but what that entails, to whom was it leaked, and all these questions remain unanswered. We don't know if it's industrial espionage for some of the companies that are bidding it, or if Russia's gotten a look at our new warship plans, or what's going on here.
The military is not known for its transparency, and to some extent should never be. But this is just such a quagmire of questions that we're sort of left just wondering exactly what's going on. It's not something that seems partisan. This has been sort of a controversy in the background for a few years, so it dates multiple administrations. But it's just not something that happens in general, that your country's second in command of the military gets fired. There's a question mark here, and that's why we bring it up, because this could blow up.
Yeah, and no charges have been laid at this time, which often, when a senior officer gets relieved of command, you at least get a sense of where it's coming from. There might be some statement to the effect of Colonel Williams has been arrested for murder. Those sorts of stuff there's at least a statement that comes out or something like that. But to have it be so secretive is a little surprising, that there's no details being provided. The Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, the CDS have all refused to basically say anything. The military basically hasn't put out anything more than he's been relieved. And we just don't know anything. And that's a little odd. And while it doesn't appear to be partisan in nature, having a little more details would be helpful to kind of, I guess, just rule out the obvious on that. Because, when it is this secret, people start to speculate. And military tends to like to keep things reasonably quiet as far as that, both for OPSEC purposes. Any little bit of information, when compiled with every other little bit of information, it can paint a picture of the status of forces, all of these other important bits of information that can let hostile intelligence agencies develop a better picture of what your capabilities are and everything. So there's completely valid reasons for that. But at the same time, if he was being run as a spy by the Chinese or something, when you relieve him of command, it's a pretty clear signal that operation has been blown and, it's going to come to an end. So you don't get anything out of it on the OPSEC side, as far as I can tell, because by publicly removing him from his position, you've signaled to whoever it was he may have leaked this stuff to that the leak has been found. And you also get a little bit of kind of the siege mentality when it comes to bad press related to the forces. There's definitely a tendency to perceive the media as somewhat hostile to the military, and whenever kind of a bad story comes out, there's kind of a tendency to close ranks and, try and put your best face forward on this. The military is kind of very worried about its public image in a lot of respects, especially because it tends to be underfunded and being one of those things politicians like to cut whenever they face any issues, there's a tendency to try and, within the organization, put the best face forward. So I can kind of understand that here, but at the same time, this is just so public. You kind of got to say something to at least stop the speculation.
Because that's all we're doing here, and that's all we really can do for now. We'll definitely keep our ears out for more news on this. But while we're on the topic of sort of controversies, one that's not very quiet is the explosion or slow motion train wreck that is the Progressive Conservative Party of Alberta's leadership contest. I can't even really wrap my head around what exactly is going on there, other than the party that was government for 45 years is determined to tear itself apart, in part because that's what Jason Kenney explicitly wants to do, and also in part because no one else really knows what they want to do with the party. The latest, as far as I can tell, and we'll put some links to some of the coverage in the Calgary Herald and Edmonton Journal in our show notes, is everyone's agreed that Jason Kenney's running away with this leadership race. No one's really mounting a real effective challenge. We talked about a couple months ago how two of the women stepped down from the race, and Sandra Jensen has since joined the government bench with the NDP. But Kenney's installed his people at most of the district levels, and he's also got the leaders of the youth wing on his side. Meanwhile, the party executive are largely still the old guard, the brass from the Alison Redford or even before. Those people are still around, and they still want to see the PC party continue to exist. Kenney has run on the single issue platform of merging with the Wild Rose to defeat the NDP, a Unite the Right platform. And this has sort of come to the heads as the party exec have essentially kicked one of Kennedy's strategists out of the party, saying it was a unanimous vote, with the current interim leader, Rick McIver, apparently voting for it before he said he didn't really vote for it. And now there's a sort of he said issue going on with open letters demanding resignations and people yelling at each other. And it's all very public and amusing. And unless I imagine that you're a PC supporter, in which case it's probably depressing as all hell. So yeah, I don't really have anything particular to add about it other than it's too bad the strategists aren't here to actually dissect this, or at least laugh at it.
Yeah, it's turning into its own Northern Tire Fire right now. And it's the sort of thing you see when a party gets kind of kicked hard in the face, even if it's not that hard a kick. Sometimes the shock of it can cause the party to lose focus and kind of not know what to do with itself. You kind of saw the same thing actually with the federal NDP when, despite having their second best showing ever, they were so set on, this is going to be our time, we're going to win, that when they didn't, they kind of didn't know what to do with themselves. The old divisions kind of resurfaced, which kind of what happened here when you lost power. And, normally this would be kind of that rebuilding phase where you kind of go into it and rebuild and decide what your party's going to stand for and everything. But it's also those situations where you kind of need someone to put a vision forward for it, or at least have those internal debates. The federal Conservatives are doing it right now fairly successfully, although we'll see how long that lasts with O'Leary in the race, where, a bunch of policy proposals have been put forward, some good, some bad, but, they're at least doing the party rebuilding phase fairly successfully, at least as of this moment. And that's just not what's happening in Alberta at all, and it's means they're vulnerable to a Kenney-like figure swooping in to try and upset the apple cart and, run away with it for its own purposes.
Yeah, it's a very good chance the party will just get blown up because I think under their rules they can't actually merge with the Wild Rose. They have to detonate the party, hope the Wild Rose does the same, and then all the people go to something new, or maybe they'll just blow up the PC party and everyone will just join the Wild Rose, and
they presumably can alter the party constitution, but it's going to be a huge fight, and you have all the old guard and whatnot. It's not something the leader can voluntarily do. There's a lot of background procedural issues that would have to be sorted out, and that's not something that, Jason Kenney can win the leadership one moment and turn around and merge the party the next.
So it's going to keep being just a mess which is, I guess, good news for Rachel Notley, because she's got one less sort of opposition party to worry about while it eats itself. The Wild Rose, I think she would be happy to take on in general elections, because she can just find like a fire type comments regularly from their members and supporters to just sort of mock and say, look, we're being a moderate center-left NDP, or you could have these, wingnuts running your province. And there's a risk there that people will choose the wingnuts, but gotta hope that they don't go down that dark path.
And that has been Politicos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. And if you have any ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.